Hi, I'm Suzanne Tapp. I'm the Executive Director of the Teaching, Learning, and Professional Development Center at Texas Tech University. Today I'm going to be sharing some tips for online discussions with you. I'm excited to get started. So I've been able to teach online with the University Studies program for the past 4 years. Been really fortunate in that regard. And I use the online discussion tools quite often in my classes. At the TLPDC, one thing that we value is sharing practical, easy ideas. So what I'm doing today, to be really transparent, is using Skype for Business, and I'm recording myself with a simple tool that we all have access to. I prepared a script because I'm going to be talking over a few simple PowerPoint slides and just recording via Skype. I'm going to take this then, use that script, and be able to very easily upload this to YouTube and add captions. That's a really important feature as we think about accessibility moving to online teaching in the summer. So let's get started. What I'm going to do now is share my screen so that you can see these PowerPoint slides. All right. This isn't going to be perfect, but I actually think that's a-okay, don't you? Here we go. All right, tips for online discussions. If we look at what the research tells us about learning, we know that when students use new information or skills, they're more likely to encode that new information in their minds and to remember it. Discussions are a great way to do this and a tool in the online class as we look for ways to increase interaction, not just from an instructor to a student, but also from student to student. Let's get started with a few practical ideas. This might seem really obvious, but where do you start a discussion? You start a discussion with a prompt. Why? It's a bit misleading, isn't it, to call something a discussion board if you have questions or prompts that are actually not discussion questions. If your discussion begins with a question or a prompt to which you know the answer, that's not a great start. If you expect a specific answer or a specific type of answer, that's not a discussion, that's a quiz. So a few ideas for discussion prompts. First, depending on your course content, you could begin with an open question and encourage speculative back and forth interaction by asking your students to start their post with sentences such as, "I wonder," or "I notice." I think the best discussions are aimed around open questions which students engage in. Maybe you could provide a muddiest point forum for students so that they could have a place to indicate something that wasn't clear to them from a current module or chapter or idea in your course. They could share the learning challenge that has them stumped, and the purpose of the discussion would then be to encourage students to answer their peers' questions. Your role is to moderate the forum so that misinformation doesn't circulate. Maybe you use a case study and ask students to respond to the case study. The best case studies provide enough detail to be nuanced, have several possible solutions, and in an academic setting at least, require students to use the material that they should already know, incorporate new material, and maybe even their lived experience. A fourth way is very traditional, and that is to prompt a discussion that corresponds to the module or the content, and to ask students to apply the knowledge to their context or to interpret it, perhaps by incorporating material from the text or from citations. For example, in my course, my students recently read about workplace conflict and then applied strategies with their own examples of difficult situations in the workplace. If they were uncomfortable sharing a personal story or maybe didn't have something to share, they could use a hypothetical situation or stories that they had heard from others. They were required to cite the strategy they recommended as a possible solution to resolve the conflict. There were some great stories. Here's a fifth idea. Start the discussion with a question. The first student answers the question and then asks a new question. The second student answers the first student's question and asks a new one, and so on. This continuous questioning can prevent redundancy and provide a broader range of topics to the discussion. Some faculty tweak this idea to allow students to add a citation or a case or a news article. Lots of different options there. It's always best to start thinking about how the strategy fits into your learning objectives for the course, and in that case, what style of question you want to use to help students achieve that goal. We've talked about a few possible question strategies, but next you might consider a few other parameters to help you manage the discussion. I've learned that you need to be specific and set some boundaries. These should be outlined in your syllabus, in course announcements, and perhaps in the first discussion. I favor a bit of redundancy in an online environment because I want several attempts to be sure that I'm on the same page with my students. So one example is to be clear with your expectations about the length of the required post in the discussion. How long should each post be? This is certainly a common question, and most faculty I know provide a required word length. So maybe you say something like 250 words for their post to the discussion prompt and 100 or 150 words on their responses to others. In an upper division course, you might increase this to 500 words and 250 words in their reply. Here's another example of parameters. I set a timing requirement for discussion posts. When do you want students to reply? I have parameters on timing because in the past, when I didn't, I noticed that most of my students would wait to post at the last minute on Sunday evening. As a result, the discussion lacked the back and forth discussion element that's important to that class. I intended for discussions to be an opportunity for the class to engage and interact with each other and me. And by posting at the last minute, it wasn't happening. I always participate in discussions and comment on student posts, and it frustrated me when I felt like it was wasted time. So I've given you an example here from my syllabus. It's a little excerpt that shows my expectations about their post replies, the timing, and then how I will contribute as well. Now, one common complaint that we hear about online discussions is frustration over the poor quality of student responses to their peers. It's common to ask students to reply to each other to get that interaction back and forth. But you might notice that when we ask students to discuss a classmate's post, they often parrot the ideas of the original post or write whatever kind of statements, meaning that they fill the space with opinions, praise, basically checking the box that they completed the reply to two peers requirement without doing critical thinking, adding research, or honest thought. Grading their responses accordingly. In other words, if they write blah, blah, blah to meet the word requirement, instead of providing substantive replies, they don't receive full credit. Here's my tip. I am typically very active in the first discussion and try to reply to insubstantial posts with questions. What part of the original post do you agree with? What evidence do you have that supports your stance? Is there any point that you'd like to add to further the conversation? The first discussion points are sometimes not what students expect, and if that happens, I talk about that in the week's announcement or video and remind everyone of my expectations. Jumping in heavily to that first discussion is also a time for me to make sure that my thresholds for the kind of writing that I want to see are being adhered to. For example, if my purpose is to give students an opportunity to converse as if they are business professionals, I need to model that early and address it if I see problems in their discourse, spelling errors, grammar problems. If my focus is on content and informal language is acceptable to me, then I want to let them know that I'm comfortable, maybe with a texting style language, with really informal type writing. I provide examples of how I define those substantive replies. I want the expectation set early so that we're all on the same page. Here's two different ideas, or a few different ideas for student responses on discussion posts compared to that traditional style response to a peer. So think about this. Could you have students limit their replies to others to 140 characters, in other words, Twitter style, to funnel down the fluff and focus on essential comments only? This practice is succinct writing style and avoids repetition, and there's a bonus that it's easier to grade, right? Or have students reply with a yes, no, yes, but, yes, or the same thing with no and, no but, no or, and specific evidence to support their opinion. For example, a student could reply, yes, but what about XYZ? Or no, and maybe bring in an outside source. Or what about a kind of template, a format, if you will? One example is the 3CQ format, where you ask students to write one compliment, one comment, one connection, and one question in their post. If you prefer a more conversational style response, you might look at other tools such as Slack or Discord. Some faculty on our campus, particularly STEM faculty, use Piazza. If you're interested in one of these tools, please give the TLPDC a call and we can refer you to some other colleagues who have experience with these resources in their classes. I use Blackboard threaded discussions because I don't want to introduce another tool for me and for them. And what about a few grading strategies? You could lump all of the discussions into one participation or discussion grade. You could also have students write a self-reflection of their participation at the end of the course and allow them to provide their own score, to assess their own score. They actually know how much effort they put into the discussion, and they're often honest about this. Because I have a strict policy about when students should post in the discussion, my tip is that I tend to go into the discussion board the morning after the initial post is due, click on the button that says Grade Discussions, and I give zeros to students who didn't participate on time. I copy my syllabus policy into the comments in their grade, and I remind them about my expectations. I also try hard to encourage them and remind them that discussions are important to the class. Honestly, this seldom becomes a pattern with students, and if I do have a student who consistently misses the deadline, I follow up to help problem solve. After all, they could always post earlier. Here I've listed my contact information and my email. Of course, I'd love to speak with you more about this. Let me get out of this PowerPoint and I'll stop sharing my screen there. There we go. To finish up our time together. Thank you for joining me. In my experience, online discussions are a place where you have the opportunity to hear student voices and to engage with them in a different way. I found that my students, some of them really come alive in that written format and blossom. It can be a great way to connect with students. It's a known tool, and there's a reason we still use online threaded discussions. I appreciate your participation in the video today. If you have any questions, follow up with me. I'd love to talk with you more. Take care.